Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of RE047, where I take stories I've narrated in the past and update them to modern audio standards. I hope that you enjoy. Farmhand, written by NoddingCrow. Kivik eyed the beehive nervously and gripped the long twig in both hands. She'd seen Mama do this a dozen times. And every time she did this, she then brought back sweet, sticky honey. She just had to be brave, like Ma. She jabbed a stick forward, sending the hive rocking on its branch, but not getting it to fall. She frowned and jabbed again and gave a slightly more aggressive swing. The hive fell to the ground and cracked against the rock and roots, and the air was filled by a rising chorus of buzzing. Kivik turned and ran, claws digging into the soft ground of the meadow as she screamed. A few dozen of the swarm seemed to take an interest in her and gave chase. The lizard folk's screams gave way to nervous and raucous laughter as she flew through the tall grass. She couldn't explain it, but in running through the meadow, hearing the swarm fade in the distance behind her, feeling the wind whip past, she never felt more alive. It almost made up for going hungry. Her joy was cut short as she stumbled, foot catching on a rise in the earth and sending her sprawling into the dirt. She rose with a curse, then quickly glanced around to make sure Mama hadn't heard. She didn't like naughty words. Instead, her eyes widened as she looked into the darkness of a cave. A circular burrow, well hidden from the light above and invisible from the road, but as wide as she was tall. She took a cautious step or two towards the tunnel, but balked at the stench on the cold air that drifted up at her. It smelled of old meat and blood, and an unclean outhouse. It smelled of death. She took a hasty step back as a glinting pair of dark eyes looked out at her from the blackness, turned and ran at that second. She was already running by the time the third opened. Goblins didn't often hunt during the day, but who would say no to fresh meat delivering itself to the door? The trio grabbed their knives and spears and ran out into the sunlight in chase. Kivik was running back towards the city walls as fast as her legs could carry her, but the goblins' mouths watered as they pursued. She was fast, but not fast enough. The farmer sighed heavily as he dropped an empty bucket. It had been a hard couple of hours. His fingers were sore and his back ached. Still, as he looked out over the field, he couldn't help but feel a warm glow of satisfaction. Or was that just the sunburn? He laughed gently to himself as he turned back towards the farmhouse. He really needed to hire on a couple of farmhands at some point, but then they wouldn't be his. A stupid sentiment, perhaps. He paused by the door, a faint prickling on the back of his neck. An enchantment, almost forgotten, an old soldier's best friend. The farmers grabbed his scabbard from where it hung near the door and looked out over the field surrounding his home. Hand on amulet he wore around his neck. A couple of merchants argued near the city gates. A child played in the long grass. A pair of hawks swooped and clashed in the air. All was quiet, peaceful, normal. Then prickling intensified, and the amulet grew warm in his hand. Another glance, and perhaps. He watched a young lizard folk out in the grass. Its movements were erratic, panicked, or just excited and playing a game. It looked behind itself, and he could almost hear the scream as it fell, or the coarse, billowing laughter of its kind. The amulet was hot, and the farmer swore. Some things never changed. Trust in your colleagues, trust in your gear, trust in your gut. He drew his sword and muttered a single word under his breath as he stepped forward. Quick step. Kivik's lungs burned from the exertion. The muscles in her legs shook. The wound in her right leg bled profusely from where the goblin's javelin had embedded itself. She tried desperately to shuffle backwards on her back, away from the leering faces of her killers. So close, but so far. One of them raised a knife and a crack like thunder, a figure striding out from behind her, as if from nowhere, blade raised. It stepped over her, positioning itself between her body and the goblins as they scampered back to reposition. The one who had his knife raised recovered first, leaping at the newcomer with deadly grace, his blade going straight for the man's neck. The swordsman moved faster, his blade singing through the air as it first knocked the dagger aside, then sank itself in the goblin's neck. A wet, sticky spray, as he dislodged his sword, made Kivik shudder, but her guardian stood unfazed. The remaining 2 goblins spread themselves out, coming at him from either side with spears raised. He pointed at one and muttered a word she couldn't hear. A blazing blue flame erupted from his fingertips and bored into the goblin's skull. He dropped lifeless as a final companion turned and fled. The swordsman, no, the mage, simply bent down and picked up a dagger dropped by the first kill. With an almost effortless flick, it spun through the air and buried itself in the goblin's back, and the beast fell to the ground, motionless. The human turned to her then, his face weather-worn and splattered with gore. Cold, hard eyes looked at her, into her, and Kivik shrunk away. His face softened, and he wiped his blade on the grass before needing to look at her leg. A moment of agony as he pulled the throwing spear out, then blissful relief as he poured something onto the wound. The flesh knitted itself together, the scales fused over. A healing potion, a good one at that. Kivik doubted Mama could afford one of those if she saved up for a year. "Are you all right, kid?" The human's voice was deep, rough. The voice of a shouting orders in the chaos of battle, of parleying with kings and generals alike. "Yes, my lord," the young Drake shuddered, and bowed her head as best she could. The human skilled in the blade and magic had to be a knight, or something worse. The man chuckled, threading his sword through his belt, and pulled her up to her feet. "Not anymore, kid. Please call me John. What were you doing out here? Gods, what's your name?" "Kivik, Sir John. I was trying to gather honey." Her stomach grumbled meaningfully at that thought, and the human looked back. "Just John Kivik. I'm retired from that life now. I'm a farmer and nothing more. Come on, let's get you back to the city. The Watcher want to know what you stumbled on. Did you see any more?" "No, my lord. No. Just 3. The pair walked in silence for a few moments before she spoke up again. "Sir, John, thank you." Think nothing of it." The farmer coughed and gave her a tired-looking wink over his shoulder. "Just doing what I can, what anyone should. Oh, well, I hope you'll be more careful in the future. Might not always be around to save you. You got a craft, kid?" "No, sir." The scales around Kivik's snout darkened in a blush. "Ma can't afford to get me into the schools and, well, not many people here want to hire drakes anyway."
Well,
John rested a hand on his hilt, leaning against his fence and running the other hand through his head.
I'm in need of a farmhand. It is tough work, but I'll teach you and pay you fairly."
"Could you teach me to fight, sir? To help others? To not need you in the future?" John's face darkened at that, and when he spoke, his voice seemed lost in an otherworldly distance.
"It's a terrible thing, kid, to kill. Are you sure you want to learn that?"
"No, sir." Kivik wilted, her tail drooping. Had she asked the wrong question?
"Good, correct answer."
He turned and entered his farmhouse. A rattling of wooden doors, a clang of metal, a curse that made Kivik giggle, and he re-emerged, a woven sack in his hand.
"Bread, cheese, smoked pork. Should be enough for you and a few others. Eat well, sleep well. Meet me just after sunrise tomorrow."
He pressed a pair of silver pieces into her hand as she stood dumbfounded.
"And buy a short sword. I will teach you once the work is done. After all, farming can be dangerous. But always remember that to kill is an option of last resort. I'll teach you more tomorrow."
He gave her a smile and turned back to his store, before turning back with one last addendum.
"Hey, don't tell the Watch I can cast, all right? After all, I'd hate for them to pull me out of my retirement."
End of story. I'd quickly like to thank the T5 peeps: Cold War Boomerwaffen, Severin Cerberus, Bushmaster 177, Henry the Red, Caspar Arnholtz, Cold War Boomerwaffen, Elijah Silvercross, Dragzoon WRE, and Severin Cerberus. Thank you very much.